Before Europe learned to fear them, the Norse lived quietly at the margins of the known world. Scandinavia was not a place that invited easy settlement. The winters were long, the soil was thin, the growing season left little room for error. Most of the land was forest, rock, or ice, but the coastline stretched further than anyone could walk in a lifetime, and the sea was always there. So they learned the water, not as something to fear or cross reluctantly, but as something to live on. The sea was their road, their larder, and their connection to everything beyond the horizon. They worshipped gods of storm and cunning. They believed the world would end in fire and ice, and that the highest honor was to be remembered after death. Their society was organized around chieftains, loyalty, and the giving of gifts. Power was personal, not institutional. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen. They had lived this way for centuries, and then, sometime in the late 8th century, something shifted. Perhaps the population outgrew what the land could support. Perhaps political rivalries pushed younger sons to seek fortune elsewhere. Perhaps they simply realized what was out there. Whatever the reason, the edge of the world was about to move. Everything depended on the ships. Without them, the Norse were farmers on difficult land. With them, they could reach anywhere the water touched, and the water touched almost everywhere. The longship was not a single invention. It was the result of generations of refinement. Clinker-built, with overlapping oak planks riveted together, flexible enough to bend with the waves rather than fight them, shallow enough to beach on any shore or sail up rivers that were supposed to be impassable. A warship might carry 30 men and still draw less than half a meter of water. It could cross the open Atlantic. It could also glide silently into a harbor at dawn. The keel was the breakthrough. A single timber running the length of the hull, giving the ship stability without weight. It allowed the Norse to add a mast and a sail without sacrificing speed under oar. Navigation was done without instruments, by the sun, by the stars, by the color of the water and the behavior of birds. Knowledge that was never written down, but passed from one sailor to the next. No other culture in Europe had anything like this. Not in speed, not in range, not in versatility. The longship did not just carry the Vikings, it made them possible. On the 8th of June, 793, ships appeared off the coast of northeast England. The monks on the island of Lindisfarne had no reason to expect what followed. Their monastery was old, respected, and rich. It held silver, gold, manuscripts, and reliquaries accumulated over generations. It had no walls, no garrison, no weapons. The Norse came ashore fast. They took what could be carried. They killed those who stood in the way. They dragged others to the ships. To the Christian world, the attack made no sense. A holy place, sacked by pagans. The scholar Alcuin wrote that nothing like it had been heard of in Britain before. But to the Norse, it was not sacrilege. It was simply a place with treasure and no defense. The distinction between sacred and secular meant nothing to people who worshipped different gods. Lindisfarne was not the first Norse voyage beyond Scandinavia, but it was the moment the rest of Europe became aware that something had changed. The edge of the world had arrived at their door. After Lindisfarne, the raids spread. The Norse had discovered a pattern that worked. Wealthy targets, weak defenses, fast approach, faster departure, and they repeated it with increasing confidence. Monasteries along the coasts of England, Ireland, and Scotland were struck first, then river towns in Francia, then harbours and trading posts further south. The longships made each raid possible. A crew could appear at dawn, strike before a defense could be organized, and vanish on the tide. They could sail up rivers that were supposed to be safe. They could beach on any shore and relaunch in minutes. A raiding party might number 30 men or 300. They took silver, livestock, grain, and tools. They did not waste time. What could not be carried was often burned. For the communities on the receiving end, the experience was terror. Not a single great battle, but repeated, unpredictable violence that could arrive at any coastline, at any time. And for decades, no one in Western Europe found an effective way to stop it. Among everything the Norse took, people were the most valuable. The Viking world ran on slavery. It was not hidden or incidental. It was structural. Slaves, called thralls, worked the farms, rowed the ships, and served in the households of every chieftain and prosperous farmer in Scandinavia. Raids provided a steady supply. Captives taken in Ireland, England, and Francia were brought back to Scandinavian settlements or sold at markets across the Norse trading world. Dublin became one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. The eastern routes were no different. The Rus carried Slavic captives south along the Volga and the Dnieper to sell in Constantinople and Baghdad. Arab sources describe these transactions in detail. The trade was enormous. A healthy captive might be worth more than a good sword, more than a set of furs. Slavery was not a byproduct of the Viking Age. It was one of its economic foundations. This is the part of the story that is often softened or overlooked, but it cannot be separated from the rest. The ships, the raids, the settlements, the trade routes, all of it was connected to the movement of human beings as property. It was, perhaps, the oldest economy in the world, and the Norse were among its most efficient practitioners. While the Danes and Norwegians sailed west, the Swedes turned east. They followed rivers, the Volga, the Dnieper, waterways that cut through dense forests and open steppe, connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian beyond. These Eastern Norse, later called the Rus, were traders first. They carried furs, amber, honey, and slaves south. In return, they brought back silver, silk, and spices from markets most Europeans did not know existed. The scale of this exchange was enormous. More Arabic silver coins have been found in Scandinavia than in most of the Islamic world's western neighbors. The trade was not marginal. It was the economic engine of the Viking Age. Arab writers described these Norsemen along the Volga. They noted their height, their tattoos, their ritual ship burials. One account, written by Ibn Fadlan, records a funeral so elaborate it has been studied ever since. The Rus did not simply pass through. They settled. They built fortified trading posts that became cities. Novgorod, Kiev. Foundations that would, in time, become something no one on those rivers could have predicted. The Viking world was never only about the West. Half of it faced east, and that half built something that lasted. In 865, the nature of the raids changed. A large Norse force landed in East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles called it the Great Heathen Army. It did not come to raid and leave. It came to take land. The army moved through England with a discipline the earlier raids had lacked. Northumbria fell first. Its king was killed. East Anglia followed. Then Mercia. One by one, the English kingdoms broke. This was not a summer raiding party. The Norse wintered in England. They seized horses. They demanded tribute. They established camps that became permanent. The leaders were said to be the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar, Halfdan, and Uber. Whether the legend was true or useful, it gave the army a story to march behind. By the early 870s, most of England was under Norse control or influence. Only one kingdom remained standing, Wessex, and its survival was far from certain. By the winter of 878, it seemed as though Wessex too would fall. The Norse had launched a surprise attack during Twelfth Night, when the court was celebrating. Alfred, King of Wessex, was driven into the marshes of Somerset with a small band of followers. He had no army, no fortress, no clear path forward. For weeks he lived as a fugitive in the wetlands. The man who was supposed to protect the last English kingdom was hiding in a swamp. But Alfred did not surrender. He sent messengers. He gathered loyalists. He planned. In the spring he called the Fyrd, the militia of free men, to meet him at Egbert's Stone in Wiltshire. They came, enough of them at least to form an army. At the Battle of Edington, Alfred's forces met the Norse in open combat. The shield walls locked, and this time it was the Norse who broke. The result was not the end of Norse England. Alfred negotiated a treaty. The Norse leader Guthrum was baptized. England was divided. The south and west remained Saxon. The north and east became the Danelaw. It was a compromise, not a victory. But it was enough. Wessex survived. And from its survival, something larger would eventually grow. The Norse did not just take land, they lived on it. Across the Danelaw, Scandinavian families cleared fields, built farmsteads, and raised livestock as though they had always been there. They married locally. They adapted. They stayed. Their presence sank into the language itself. Any English town ending in by, Whitby, Derby, Grimsby, carries the Old Norse word for settlement. Thwaite meant a clearing. Thorpe meant a village. The map of northern England is still a map of Norse occupation. They brought their own legal traditions. The Thing, an assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes and make decisions, became part of English governance in the Danelaw. Some of these institutions outlasted the people who introduced them. Within a generation, the distinction between Norse and English was already blurring. Children grew up speaking both languages. Farmers used whichever tools worked. The gods changed slowly, if they changed at all. Perhaps this was always the other side of the Viking story. Not the destruction, but the building. Not the raid, but what came after. They were not passing through. They were putting down roots. And over time, the roots held. England was not the only place the Norse settled. It was simply the most recorded. In Ireland, the Norse had founded Dublin as a trading port in the mid-9th century. What began as a raiding base became a city. Ships arrived carrying furs, silver, and slaves. Craftsmen set up workshops. A permanent population took root. Dublin was never entirely Norse and never entirely Irish. It existed between the two. A hybrid place, governed by Norse kings, populated by both peoples, and connected by trade to markets as far away as Baghdad. In northern France, the pattern was different, but the outcome similar. In 911, a Norse warlord named Rollo was given control of a territory in exchange for defending it against other Vikings. The land became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Within 3 generations, the Normans spoke French, worshipped as Christians, and had become some of the most effective rulers in Europe. The Norse had a remarkable ability to absorb. They took languages, customs, and religions from wherever they settled, and within a generation or two, they were indistinguishable from the people around them. Except in their ambition. That, perhaps, was the one thing they carried with them everywhere. They kept going. From Iceland, a man named Eric sailed west. He had been exiled for killing. In Norse society, banishment did not mean prison. It meant you had to find somewhere else to exist. He found Greenland, a vast island locked in ice with a narrow strip of habitable coast along the southwest. He named it Greenland, deliberately, knowing that a good name attracted settlers. It worked. Within a few years, 2 small colonies clung to the fjords, farming and hunting walrus in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Then, around the year 1000, Eric's son Leif sailed further still. He reached a land with forests thicker than anything in Iceland or Greenland, and wild plants growing that the Norse had never seen. They called it Vinland. We call it North America. They built a small settlement at a place now known as L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. It did not last. The distance was too great. Iron rivets, a bronze cloak pin, a spindle whirl. 500 years before Columbus, the Norse stood on American soil. And then they left. Not because they had to, perhaps, but because some edges are simply too far from home. The Norse did not worship quietly. Their gods were violent, cunning, and mortal. Odin traded an eye for wisdom. Thor fought giants with a hammer. Loki burned everything he touched. The world itself was destined to end in Ragnarok, a final battle that even the gods would lose. These were not stories about salvation. They were stories about endurance, about meeting destruction without flinching. The highest honor was a death that would be remembered. But as the Norse settled among Christians, the old religion began to shift. It was rarely a sudden conversion. More often it was practical. A Norse trader in Dublin might wear Thor's hammer and a Christian cross at the same time. A chieftain who accepted baptism could gain powerful European allies. A king who claimed Christian authority could centralize power in ways the old gods did not permit. Christianity offered something the Norse religion did not: a written tradition, a universal structure, and a god who did not die. By the end of the 10th century, the Scandinavian kings had officially converted. The old gods did not disappear overnight. They lingered in place names, in customs, in stories told around the fire. But the institutional power shifted. The gods of storm and war gave way to a god of order. And with that order came something the chieftains had never quite achieved on their own: permanence. For most of the Viking Age, Scandinavia had no nations. Power was local. A chieftain controlled a fjord, a stretch of coast, a network of loyalty. Authority was personal, earned through generosity and violence in roughly equal measure. If your followers lost faith, they left. If a rival proved stronger, you died. But by the late 900s, ambitious men began to consolidate. Harald Bluetooth united Denmark. Harald Fairhair fought to bring Norway under a single crown. The process was uneven. It was resisted, but it moved in one direction. Christianity made centralization possible. A Christian king could claim authority from God. He could build alliances with the rest of Europe. He could replace the old networks of personal loyalty with something institutional, something that survived the death of any single ruler. The most successful was King Canute. By 1016 he ruled England. By 1018, Denmark. By 1028, Norway. For a brief moment, a Norse king held a North Sea empire together through personal will and administrative skill. It did not survive him. Empires held together by one person rarely do. But the transformation was real. The world that had produced raiders was being replaced by the world those raiders now governed. Chieftains became kings, and kings built states. The Viking Age did not fade. It ended in a single autumn. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, crossed the North Sea with a fleet of 300 ships. He was perhaps the most experienced warrior in Scandinavia. He had fought as a Varangian guard in Constantinople, accumulated a fortune, and believed England was his by right. He landed in the north and won his first battle at Fulford. But the English king, Harold Godwinson, marched his army 200 miles in 4 days. At Stamford Bridge, on the 25th of September, the two forces met. Hardrada was killed. His army was broken. Of the 300 ships that had come, fewer than 30 sailed home. Harold had no time to rest. 3 days later, news arrived that another fleet had landed on the south coast. William, Duke of Normandy. A man descended from Norse settlers, the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo. Harold marched south. At Hastings on the 14th of October, he was killed and his army destroyed. The last great Viking invasion of England had failed, and the man who took the throne in its place carried Norse blood in his veins. The Viking Age is measured between two events: the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 and the battle at Stamford Bridge in 1066. Less than 3 centuries. A brief window in the scale of history. But the marks it left were not brief. Their descendants governed kingdoms from Sicily to Russia. The Normans, Norse by origin, reshaped England, conquered southern Italy, and built crusader states in the Levant. The Rus gave their name to Russia itself. Icelandic settlers created a literary tradition, the sagas, that preserved not just stories, but a way of seeing the world that still reads as modern. In the English language, hundreds of everyday words come from Old Norse. Window, knife, egg, husband, skull, they, them, their. The language of the people who raided England became part of the language England speaks. They brought legal traditions too. The concept of a jury of peers, the local assembly, the idea that free men had a voice in governance. These were not exclusively Norse ideas, but the Norse carried them into the cultures they joined. Perhaps the truest thing about the Norse is that they were never just one thing. They were raiders who became traders, traders who became settlers, settlers who became kings, pagans who became Christians, outsiders who became the establishment. They did not simply attack the world they found. They entered it. And in doing so, they changed it in ways that are still visible, still spoken, still lived in. The ships are gone. But the wake they left has never fully settled.